Blood pooled on pristine marble. A police chief's wife lay dead in her own kitchen. But this wasn't a random break-in gone wrong. This was something far more sinister. Marcus Bailey had it all. Respect. Power. A badge that commanded authority across Providence. For 20 years, he'd sworn to protect and serve. But behind that badge, a web of corruption so twisted, it would take his own brother to unravel it. When Vanessa King discovered the truth about her husband, the embezzlement, the bribes, the secret families, she made a choice. Stand for what's right, or stay silent for an easier life. That choice would cost her everything. This is the story of a woman who refused to look away. A corrupt cop who believed he was untouchable. And the moment he realized that no one is above the law. Before we dive into this case, if you're fascinated by true crime stories that expose corruption at the highest levels, you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell so you never miss our deep dive investigations. And if this story gets under your skin the way it did ours, drop a like and share it, because stories like Vanessa's deserve to be heard. Now let's get into it. March 15th, 2024. A date that would forever mark Providence, Rhode Island. The kind of night where rain tapped against windows and the city felt quieter than usual. But inside one particular mansion, silence had taken on a different meaning entirely. The kind of silence that comes after something terrible has happened. The kind that makes responding officers exchange uneasy glances, their training telling them one thing while their instincts scream another. Vanessa King's body lay motionless on the kitchen floor, blood pooling around her in stark contrast to the pristine white marble. Her eyes were frozen in what could only be described as a look of betrayal, the kind of expression that haunts investigators long after they've left a crime scene. The first officers on the scene knew immediately this wasn't going to be a standard call. They were standing in Police Chief Marcus Bailey's home. And the victim? His wife. Now, here's where things get interesting. What initially appeared to be a home invasion, drawers pulled open, jewelry scattered, signs of forced entry at the back door, would soon expose something far darker than a random act of violence. This wasn't just a murder investigation. This was about to become a case that would tear apart the Providence Police Department and reveal a truth that many didn't want to face. Sometimes, the monster wears a badge. 20 minutes after the first officers arrived, Marcus Bailey pulled up in his unmarked SUV, tires screeching against the wet pavement as he came to an abrupt halt outside the police perimeter. Picture this. A 42-year-old police chief, his face a mask of what appeared to be genuine shock and grief, pushing past the yellow crime scene tape with the kind of commanding presence that naturally parts crowds. His voice broke as he demanded to know what happened to his wife. Officers who'd served under him for years watched as he fell to his knees beside Vanessa's body. Careful, and here's the detail that would later matter, careful not to touch anything. His law enforcement training apparently overriding even his grief. But here's what those officers didn't know. Marcus Bailey had already been inside that house hours earlier, not as the distraught husband rushing to his wife's side, but as the calculated killer who had meticulously staged every detail of what they were now witnessing. The forced entry, the scattered belongings, the single gunshot wound, all of it carefully orchestrated theater. The first officer on scene, a rookie named Jameson who was visibly uncomfortable delivering bad news to his chief, laid out what they'd found. Looks like forced entry through the back door, signs of a struggle in the kitchen, single gunshot wound to the chest. The medical examiner would later estimate time of death between 2 and 4 p.m., a window during which Marcus had claimed to be at a budget meeting 40 miles away in Boston. Everything seemed to add up to a tragic home invasion. Drawers had been pulled open, contents scattered across the countertops. Vanessa's jewelry box in the master bedroom had been emptied. Classic signs of a robbery gone wrong, right? Wrong. Because what Marcus couldn't stage, what he didn't even know existed, was the audio file Vanessa had uploaded to her private cloud storage just hours before her death. A recording that would eventually become the smoking gun in his prosecution. But we'll get to that. Enter Detective Andre Mitchell. 38 years old, one of Providence PD's most respected detectives with a decade of homicide investigations under his belt and a reputation for being methodical, thorough, and, this is crucial, incorruptible. Mitchell arrived 30 minutes after the chief, and his keen eyes immediately started picking up details others might miss. The lack of muddy footprints despite the rainy weather outside. The strangely precise nature of the ransacking that somehow left all of Marcus's prized possessions completely untouched. Things weren't adding up. Mitchell nodded respectfully to Chief Bailey. Professional courtesy, after all, but he maintained his distance. That professional distance that good detectives keep when their instincts are telling them something's off. He watched as Bailey stood up, visibly composing himself, and began giving orders. Secure the perimeter. Canvass the neighborhood. Effectively taking control of the investigation into his own wife's murder. Think about that for a moment. The victim's husband, who also happens to be the police chief, directing the investigation. It's a massive conflict of interest, but in that moment, with emotions running high and the chain of command firmly established, no one questioned it. I want every resource on this, every available detective, Marcus ordered, his voice regaining that authoritative tone as he straightened his jacket. But here's a detail that Mitchell caught. Bailey's eyes darted around the room, lingering briefly on a kitchen drawer. Inside that drawer was a knife block containing a weapon that bore his fingerprints, a detail he'd overlooked in his hasty staging. Mitchell noticed that glance, filed it away in his mental notebook, started taking photographs of everything. The evidence told its own story if you knew how to read it. The spilled contents of Vanessa's purse, broken picture frames, and then there were the zip ties, police issue restraints with a distinct manufacturing mark, the same type stored in the Providence PD evidence locker. Now, most burglars don't carry police issue restraints. This connection would later prove crucial when Detective Kyle Thorne, and yes, that's Marcus Bailey's younger brother and fellow officer, discovered an evidence log showing Marcus had signed out a pack of these exact zip ties just one day before the murder. As the night wore on, neighbors gathered behind the police tape, their faces illuminated by the flashing lights and the glow of their phone screens as they recorded the scene. Providence is a small city in many ways. Everyone knows everyone, especially when you're talking about the police chief. The whispers started immediately. Just before midnight, Eleanor and Robert Vance arrived, Vanessa's parents. The sound of their anguished cries when they confirmed their daughter was dead cut through the otherwise quiet street in a way that no one present would ever forget. Miranda Vance, Vanessa's younger sister, stood stoically beside her parents, her eyes never leaving Marcus as he performed the role of grieving husband, accepting condolences from officers and neighbors alike. But Miranda had never trusted her brother-in-law. She'd sensed the coldness beneath his charming exterior. She'd actually urged Vanessa to leave him 3 months earlier when she discovered his infidelity. Standing there that night, watching Marcus play the devastated spouse, Miranda's suspicions crystallized into something darker. She knew. Maybe she couldn't prove it yet, but she knew. Detective Mitchell quietly pulled his partner aside, making sure to stay out of the chief's earshot. "We need to establish a timeline for everyone's whereabouts today," he said. His partner nodded, already pulling out his notebook to begin interviewing neighbors. They started with the elderly woman next door, who claimed to have heard a car pull into the Bailey driveway around 2:30 p.m. Marcus overheard this and quickly interjected with an explanation. It must have been the Amazon delivery he'd been expecting. A package that was now, conveniently, missing. Another detail in his fabricated robbery narrative. But here's what Marcus didn't know. And this is where criminals almost always trip themselves up. That neighbor had just installed a home security camera the week before. It had a partial view of his driveway. And that footage would later show his unmarked police SUV arriving at precisely 2:27 p.m. on the day of the murder, right in the middle of when he claimed to be 40 miles away. By 2 a.m., the initial investigation was winding down. Vanessa's body had been removed to the medical examiner's office. Crime scene technicians were finishing their evidence collection, carefully bagging and tagging everything that might prove relevant. Chief Bailey stood on his front porch, the picture of a man destroyed by tragedy, accepting a sympathetic embrace from his father, Frank Thorne, a retired sheriff who had mentored Marcus into law enforcement 2 decades earlier. His mother, Patricia, stood nearby, already making calls to arrange for Marcus to stay with them. His brother Kyle maintained a professional distance, his face unreadable as he assisted in cataloging evidence. What no one could see was the tension in Marcus's shoulders, the calculation behind those grief-masked eyes as he watched the evidence bags being loaded into the crime scene van. He was running through his plan, checking for loose ends, assessing whether everything had gone as smoothly as he'd envisioned. "We should have our preliminary findings by morning, Chief," Mitchell said, approaching Marcus with the careful deference one shows to both a superior and a victim's family member. Marcus nodded wearily, playing his part perfectly, even as his mind raced through potential problems. He made a show of asking to be kept in the loop while simultaneously suggesting that he would, of course, recuse himself from direct involvement in the investigation. The proper thing to do. The expected thing to do. Mitchell agreed, his expression giving away nothing of his growing suspicion that something about the chief's demeanor felt rehearsed. Too perfect. Too controlled for a man who'd just lost his wife. As the last police car pulled away, Marcus stood alone on his porch, believing he had orchestrated the perfect crime. That belief would prove catastrophically wrong in the days to come. Inside his parents' guest bedroom later that night, Marcus sat on the edge of the bed, phone in hand, deleting text messages between himself and Leah Greer, the mother of his secret 2-year-old son in Connecticut. The relationship with Leah had been one of several factors driving his desperate act. The financial strain of supporting a second household, the fear of losing half his pension and savings to Vanessa in a divorce, and most pressingly, the need to silence Vanessa before she could expose his corruption. The text from Leah read simply, "The money arrived. Thank you," confirming the $50,000 transfer he'd made the day before killing Vanessa. Money that prosecutors would later prove came directly from bribes Marcus had accepted from the Alvarez drug trafficking ring operating in Providence's South Side. But right then, in that guest bedroom, Marcus Bailey believed he'd gotten away with murder. He believed his badge, his position, his 20 years of service would shield him from consequences. He believed he was untouchable. He was wrong. The Providence Police Department headquarters felt different the morning after Vanessa King's murder. You could sense it the moment you walked through those doors, the hushed conversations, the way officers glanced toward Chief Bailey's empty office with expressions that mixed sympathy with something else. Uncertainty, maybe, or the first stirrings of doubt. Detective Andre Mitchell sat at his cluttered desk, phone pressed to his ear, listening intently as the medical examiner delivered preliminary findings that would set this investigation on a very different path than anyone expected. Dr. Elaine Winters had been doing this job for 22 years. Over 400 homicide examinations to her credit. She'd seen it all, or at least thought she had. Her findings were clinical, dispassionate. That's the job, but they told a story that contradicted everything about the random home invasion narrative. Yes, there was a single gunshot wound to the chest, cause of death, but there were also defensive wounds on Vanessa's hands, skin cells under her fingernails that would later be matched to Marcus, and bruising patterns on her wrists that were inconsistent with someone surprised by an intruder. These were the marks of someone who'd fought back, someone who knew her attacker. Mitchell jotted down these observations in his notepad, the pieces of a troubling puzzle beginning to take shape. He thanked the medical examiner and hung up, his expression grave as he considered the implications. The chief's wife scratched someone pretty good before she died. He informed his partner, Detective Ramirez, sliding the preliminary report across the desk. They exchanged a meaningful look. Both experienced enough to know that defensive wounds often mean the victim knew their attacker. That's not how random break-ins usually go down. The robbery narrative was falling apart under scrutiny. Crime scene technicians reported that while the house appeared ransacked, it was done in a peculiarly selective manner. Valuable electronics, a 65-inch television, a laptop sitting right there on the kitchen counter, an expensive sound system, all left completely untouched. But certain jewelry pieces were missing. Only certain ones. As if someone knew exactly what it'd take to make it look convincing, but didn't actually care about the value of what they were stealing. Because they weren't really stealing at all. Detective Mitchell rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of where this evidence might lead. He knew what it meant to investigate a fellow officer. He'd done it before, though never at this level. Never the chief of police. The political firestorm that would erupt if they pursued this line of investigation could end careers. But Mitchell had always believed in one thing above all else. The evidence doesn't lie. People do. Evidence doesn't care about politics or position. It just is. Around noon, Marcus Bailey arrived at the department dressed in civilian clothes, but carrying his badge. Officers approached him with solemn nods, murmuring condolences that he accepted with appropriate gravity. But Mitchell noticed something. How Bailey's gaze sharpened as it swept across the evidence boards in the conference room where the investigation team had gathered. He was assessing, calculating. trying to see what they discovered. "I know I should stay away, but I need to know you're making progress," Bailey stated, his voice carrying that authority that had commanded respect throughout his 15-year rise through department ranks. It was a reasonable statement, a concerned husband wanting justice for his wife. But Mitchell stood respectfully and delivered a carefully worded update, deliberately omitting certain details while watching Bailey's reaction when he mentioned the medical examiner's findings about defensive wounds. Did Bailey's eye twitch slightly? Was that a flicker of concern? Or just grief? The first official interview with Chief Bailey was scheduled for 3 p.m., a courtesy delay that Mitchell had reluctantly agreed to after Bailey mentioned needing time to arrange funeral details. Those hours gave Mitchell time to work, time to methodically assemble a preliminary timeline, mapping the known movements of all parties on the day of the murder. And that's where things got interesting. Bailey claimed he'd been at a budget meeting in Boston. The meeting ended at 1:30 p.m. He was seen at a coffee shop near the interstate at 2:50 p.m. But there was a 40-minute gap in between. 40 minutes unaccounted for. 40 minutes that would be more than enough time to make the drive back to Providence, commit murder, and head back toward Boston. When confronted with this discrepancy during the interview, Bailey had an explanation ready. He'd stopped for gas, made a phone call to a city councilman about department funding. Reasonable explanations. Except phone records would later show that call lasted only 7 minutes. Not nearly enough to account for the missing time. Mitchell noted the inconsistency, but didn't press. Not yet. Sometimes you let people think you've accepted their story, and then you tighten the noose later when they're not expecting it. "Walk us through your day again from the moment you left for Boston," Mitchell prompted, his tone professional as video cameras recorded the interview. The room was designed to be comfortable, soft lighting, neutral colors, but anyone who'd been interviewed by police knew the weight that pressed down on you in those chairs. Bailey recounted his morning with practiced precision. Breakfast with Vanessa at 7:30. Departing at 8:15 for the 10:08 meeting in Boston. Meeting ending at 1:30. Then the return trip with stops, arriving back at the station around 3:30. His body language was relaxed. Eye contact steady. The confidence of a man with nothing to hide. Or the calculated composure of someone who'd rehearsed his story until it was perfect. Mitchell inquired about the nature of Bailey's relationship with his wife, and for just a moment, just a flicker, something crossed Bailey's face. Annoyance, maybe? Before he composed himself to describe their marriage as strong despite normal challenges. A characterization that would later be contradicted when investigators discovered Vanessa's consultation with divorce attorney Patricia Mendoza 3 weeks before her death. But Bailey didn't know they'd found that yet. The interview took a subtle turn when Detective Ramirez placed a folder on the table and slid out photographs of the zip ties used to restrain Vanessa. "These are police-issue restraints, Chief," Ramirez noted, watching Bailey's reaction closely. Bailey examined the photos, furrowed his brow, then offered a plausible explanation. Such restraints were widely available, could have been purchased by anyone, stolen from any number of police vehicles. His explanation made sense on the surface. It would later collapse when his brother Kyle discovered the evidence log showing Marcus had personally signed out identical restraints the day before the murder. As the interview stretched past the 2-hour mark, subtle changes appeared in Bailey's demeanor. A tightening around the eyes. Fingers drumming briefly on the table before being stilled. Responses becoming slightly more clipped. Mitchell recognized these signs. Impatience or stress breaking through the calm exterior. Whether from grief or deception, he couldn't yet say. But he deliberately saved his most pointed questions for when fatigue might lower Bailey's guard. Questions about financial pressures. Rumors of marital discord. And finally, direct questions about Bailey's whereabouts during the critical window of 2 to 4 p.m. Bailey's response was a masterclass in authoritative deflection. He placed his police chief's badge on the table with a decisive click and said, "You know who I am. This interview is over." The power move hung in the air like smoke. Bailey stood, straightening his jacket with the practiced motion of a man accustomed to command, and Mitchell remained seated, his expression neutral despite the implicit challenge. "We appreciate your time during this difficult period, Chief," he said, his tone revealing nothing of the suspicion now firmly rooted in his mind. Bailey collected his badge, that symbol of authority he believed placed him beyond scrutiny, and walked out without another word. In the corridor, his father Frank Thorne was waiting, The former sheriff, whose legendary status in Rhode Island law enforcement still carried significant weight. The elder Thorne placed a supportive hand on his son's shoulder as they walked toward the exit, their hushed conversation inaudible to others. Mitchell watched from the doorway, noting how officers throughout the building straightened as the two men passed. A visual reminder of the institutional respect and power the Bailey Thorne family commanded in Providence. Building a case against someone with that kind of influence wouldn't just be difficult. It would be like trying to swim upstream in a river of concrete. Later that evening, Mitchell and his team gathered in a secluded conference room, away from the department's usual meeting spaces. They needed privacy for what they were about to discuss. The crime scene technicians had made another discovery. The back door of the Bailey residence showed signs of forced entry, but the tool marks appeared to have been made from the inside rather than the outside. Someone had staged that break-in from inside the house. Then there was the discovery on Vanessa's smartphone. She'd emailed investigative journalist Thomas Merrick just hours before her estimated time of death. Subject line: police corruption evidence, urgent. The email contained no attachments, though. Whatever evidence she'd planned to share, she hadn't gotten the chance to send it. But IT specialists had found something else. Vanessa had uploaded an audio file to her private cloud storage at 1:47 p.m. on the day of her murder, a recording that would become central to the entire case. The only problem? It was encrypted, and they couldn't access it without her passwords. "We need to be extremely careful how we proceed," Mitchell cautioned his team. The room was tense with unspoken understanding. They were investigating one of their own, not just any officer, the head of their department. Mitchell assigned detective pairs to different aspects of the case: financials, witness interviews, forensic evidence, alibi verification. Standard procedure, but nothing about this case was standard. As midnight approached, Detective Kyle Thorne sat alone in the evidence room, the weight of what he discovered crushing down on him like a physical thing. The evidence log in his hands showed his brother's signature, Marcus Bailey's distinctive scrawl, next to an entry for restraints, 24 count, signed out the day before Vanessa's murder. The same type of zip ties found on her wrists. Kyle had always looked up to Marcus, followed him into law enforcement largely because of his influence, built his entire identity around the integrity he believed they both shared. And now this evidence log threatened to shatter not just his relationship with his brother, but his entire worldview. What do you do when the person you've admired most in your life might be a murderer? Detective Mitchell found Kyle in this moment of crisis. He'd correctly guessed where the troubled officer might retreat to wrestle with his discovery. Mitchell quietly closed the door and took a seat across from Kyle, respecting the magnitude of what the younger man was facing. No words at first, just two cops sitting in silence, the evidence log between them like a live grenade. Finally, Kyle looked up, his expression haunted. "He signed these out yesterday morning," Kyle said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mitchell examined the form, noting Marcus Bailey's signature, then looked back at Kyle with compassion but unwavering resolve. "You know what this could mean?" Mitchell said. Not a question, a statement acknowledging the path now unavoidably before them. Kyle nodded slowly, the internal struggle visible in his eyes. Blood versus badge, family versus duty, brotherhood by birth versus brotherhood by oath. The detective took a deep breath and made the decision that would eventually break the case wide open and earn him both acclaim for his integrity and condemnation from those who valued loyalty above justice. "I need to make a statement," Kyle said, his voice finding strength in the painful clarity of choosing truth over family. Mitchell nodded, understanding both the professional necessity and personal cost of Kyle's decision. Together, they walked to the interview room to formally document what would become the first substantial crack in Marcus Bailey's carefully constructed alibi. Outside, dawn was just beginning to break over Providence, light creeping across a city that was about to learn a devastating truth about the man they'd trusted to protect them. The following morning, as Providence awakened to reports of significant developments in Vanessa King's murder investigation, Marcus Bailey was finishing a private phone call in his temporary office at City Hall, away from the police department he still technically commanded. The call was to Leah Greer in Connecticut, instructing her to deny any relationship if contacted by Providence Police, reminding her that the money he'd transferred was for their son's future. What Bailey didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know yet, was that his carefully constructed parallel lives were beginning to collapse one damning piece of evidence at a time. The walls were closing in, and they were closing in fast. The evidence log sat on Assistant District Attorney Sophia Evans's desk like a silent accusation. Under the harsh fluorescent lights of her office, Marcus Bailey's signature next to 24-count zip ties seemed to glow with damning clarity. At 38, Evans had built her reputation on prosecuting corruption cases. Her piercing intelligence and methodical approach had earned her both respect and resentment within Providence's legal community. But this, taking on the city's police chief, this was different. This could define or destroy her career. She tapped her pen against the document, her mind calculating risks. Pursuing charges against someone with Bailey's connections meant facing not just a legal battle, but a political war. Yet failing to do so, looking at this evidence and walking away, would represent a fundamental betrayal of everything she'd sworn to uphold. Detective Andre Mitchell sat across from her, his normally impassive face showing signs of strain from 3 days of intense investigation. As he laid out the mounting evidence, Evans listened with the focus of someone who knew that every detail mattered. The defensive wounds on Vanessa's hands, the falsified break-in with tool marks from the inside, suspicious financial transactions, and now this evidence log directly connecting Bailey to the murder weapon. Kyle Thorne's testimony about the evidence log is crucial, but we need more than just this to move against someone with Bailey's connections, Evans stated, her voice measured but determined as she began organizing case files into precise stacks. She'd prosecuted corrupt officials before, city councilmen, department heads, even a judge once, but never someone as powerful as the police chief, whose influence extended through law enforcement, local politics, and even the judiciary. Mitchell nodded, explaining that his team was working multiple angles, trying to decode that encrypted audio file from Vanessa's cloud storage, tracing Bailey's financial transactions and cell phone location data. The detective and prosecutor shared a moment of unspoken understanding about the difficulties ahead, not just the legal challenges, but the personal and professional backlash they'd face for targeting a man many in Providence considered a local hero. Outside Evans's office, spring rain fell steadily on the colonial architecture of Providence's judicial district, painting the windows with rivulets that blurred the world beyond. Detective Kyle Thorne sat in his parked car somewhere in that rain-soaked city, wrestling with the aftermath of his decision. The windshield wipers beat a rhythmic counterpoint to thoughts racing through his mind. Memories kept surfacing, unbidden and unwelcome. Marcus teaching him to fish at their grandfather's lake house, both of them sunburned and laughing. Standing proud at Kyle's police academy graduation, the first to embrace him after the ceremony. Comforting him after his divorce 3 years ago, sitting up until dawn talking him through it. These personal histories now collided violently with evidence pointing to Marcus as a killer, creating a cognitive dissonance so profound that Kyle felt physically ill each time he considered what his brother might have done. His phone buzzed. Another message from their mother, Patricia Thorne, begging him to reconsider what she called his betrayal of family. Her text messages had become increasingly desperate as news of Kyle's cooperation with investigators began to spread through their close-knit family. "How can you do this to your own brother?" one read. "We raised you better than this," said another. Each message was a knife twisting in his chest. But Kyle kept thinking about Vanessa, about justice, about the oath he'd taken. Sometimes doing the right thing means breaking your own heart in the process. Back at police headquarters, the digital forensics team achieved their first major breakthrough. They'd successfully retrieved partial cell tower data, placing Marcus Bailey's phone within a quarter-mile of his home during the critical window of 2:30 to 3:15 p.m. on March 15th. The lead technician, Esther Ramirez, no relation to Detective Ramirez, worked feverishly to compile the data into visual displays. The results were devastating to Bailey's alibi. The phone pings showed his device traveling from Boston toward Providence around 1:40 p.m., arriving near his home at approximately 2:25 p.m., remaining stationary until 3:15 p.m., then moving back toward Boston. When presented with this evidence later, Bailey would claim he'd forgotten his phone in his department SUV, which had been stolen that day and then mysteriously returned to the station parking lot. A desperate explanation that would fall apart when security camera footage showed him with his phone at both locations during the timeline in question. Lies have a way of multiplying, don't they? You tell one to cover the truth, then need another to cover the first lie. And pretty soon you're juggling so many fabrications that keeping them all straight becomes impossible. We've got the cell tower data, but we need to place him physically at the scene, Mitchell explained during the afternoon briefing. The conference room walls were now covered with timeline charts, photographs, and connection diagrams that looked like something from a television crime drama. Except this was real. This was someone's life ended and another person's freedom hanging in the balance. The detective had deliberately assembled a team of officers with no personal ties to Bailey, though this hadn't prevented tension from developing within the department as rumors spread about the investigation's direction. Officer Jenkins, a 20-year veteran with absolutely no stake in the outcome, provided the next potential breakthrough. During a neighborhood canvass, he'd located an elderly resident whose bird-watching hobby included keeping detailed logs of unusual activity on the street. Bird watchers, it turns out, notice everything. This particular resident had noted the chief's distinctive black SUV, the one with the broken tail light that Bailey kept meaning to fix but never did, arriving at his home at 2:27 p.m. on the day of the murder, right in the middle of when he claimed to be 40 miles away. Funny how small details like a broken tail light can unravel carefully laid plans. The investigation accelerated when forensic analysts confirmed that DNA from skin cells under Vanessa's fingernails matched Marcus Bailey. His defense would later attempt to explain this away as the result of normal marital contact that morning. Maybe they'd held hands, embraced, the usual intimate touches between spouses. But this explanation collapsed when time of death estimates narrowed to between 2:30 and 3 p.m., making morning contact insufficient to explain the presence of his skin cells beneath her broken fingernails. Those defensive wounds told their own story. Vanessa had fought her attacker, scratched him, tried desperately to survive. The medical examiner's detailed report revealed another crucial detail: gunshot residue patterns indicating the killer stood approximately 3 feet from Vanessa. Not across the room like a startled intruder might have been. Not in the doorway surprised by an unexpected homeowner. 3 feet. Close enough to see her face. Close enough to hear her final words, if she'd spoken any. This was personal. This was someone familiar to the victim, not a panicked burglar who'd been discovered mid-robbery. Most damningly, the bullet recovered from Vanessa's body matched a police-issue Glock 19, the same model carried by Providence officers. Though someone had tried to be clever, the serial number on the recovered bullet was partially obscured by what appeared to be deliberate filing marks, an attempt to prevent ballistic matching. But here's the thing about forensic science: it's gotten really, really good. Even filed markings leave microscopic signatures. You can't completely erase the truth, no matter how hard you try. By the end of the week, Detective Mitchell had assembled enough evidence to justify a search warrant for Bailey's financial records. This required approval from Judge Hernandez, known throughout the judicial district for his stringent requirements for probable cause. You couldn't just walk into his chambers with suspicions and hunches. You needed facts, evidence, a clear line from point A to point B. The judge reviewed the accumulated evidence in his chambers, his expression growing increasingly grave as Mitchell and ADA Evans outlined their case theory: that Chief Bailey had murdered his wife to prevent her from exposing his corruption and to avoid losing assets in a potential divorce. After 20 minutes of deliberation, 20 minutes that felt like 20 hours to everyone waiting, Hernandez signed the warrant. He added a handwritten note authorizing searches of all Bailey's known financial accounts, including those potentially held under aliases or in the names of associates. This comprehensive warrant would crack open a world of deception that went far beyond a single murder. The financial investigation uncovered layers of duplicity that painted a damning picture of Marcus Bailey's double life. Forensic accountant Melissa Chun, think of her as a detective who hunts through numbers instead of crime scenes, traced deposits totaling more than $200,000 over the past 18 months. These weren't going into Bailey's regular accounts, though. They were flowing into an account under the name Mark Baylor, opened with fraudulent documentation but linked to Bailey through biometric banking data. Fingerprints don't lie, and apparently, neither do bank security systems. These deposits aligned perfectly with dates of major drug busts conducted by other precincts. Busts that somehow, mysteriously, never touched the Alvarez organization's territory in South Providence. Isn't that interesting? Every other drug operation in the city getting raided, officers getting arrested, product getting seized. But this one particular organization operating without interference. That's not luck. That's protection. That's corruption. Chen also discovered regular transfers from this account to a joint account in Connecticut under the names Leah Greer and Marcus Bailey. Monthly support payments for the woman and son he'd kept secret from his wife. But it got worse. There were also payments for a luxury condo in Boca Raton, Florida. Property records revealed yet another relationship, a woman named Cassandra Wilson. A third secret family that even Leah didn't know about. Marcus Bailey wasn't just living a double life. He was living a triple life, juggling 3 separate existences like some kind of twisted circus act. He was living beyond his means on 3 fronts. Chen explained to Mitchell and Evans as they reviewed her findings in the war room. The accountant's analysis showed that Bailey's legitimate annual salary of $142,000 couldn't possibly support his multiple households, vacation properties, and luxury purchases. The math simply didn't work. Financial pressure had intensified 3 months earlier when Vanessa, who managed their household accounts, questioned several large withdrawals from their joint savings. Withdrawals Bailey had claimed were for investment opportunities, but which Chun traced directly to payments for that Florida condo. This confrontation appeared to be the catalyst. The moment Vanessa started asking questions was the moment she signed her own death warrant, though she didn't know it yet. She'd even consulted divorce attorney Patricia Mendoza, whose case notes included Vanessa's suspicions about financial impropriety and possible criminal activity. Vanessa had been building her own case, documenting everything, preparing to leave. But Marcus couldn't let that happen. Too much to lose. Too many secrets that would come spilling out in a divorce. So he made another choice. A permanent solution to what he saw as a temporary problem. The investigation reached its critical juncture when IT specialists finally broke the encryption on Vanessa's cloud storage. That audio file she'd uploaded hours before her death, they got it open. And what they heard would become the most damning evidence in the entire case. The recording, made using her smartphone's voice memo function, captured an argument between Vanessa and Marcus. You could hear her confronting him with evidence of his affair, the embezzlement of federal grant money, $200,000 meant for community policing programs that had instead gone into his pocket. Marcus's voice on that recording was chilling. First, he tried to gaslight her, suggesting she was misinterpreting legitimate transactions. Then, when that didn't work, he shifted to threats. Vanessa mentioned contacting journalist Thomas Merrick, and you could hear the menace in Marcus's response. "No one will believe you over me. I run this department, and I decide what's investigated and what isn't." Those words would echo through the courtroom months later, a dead woman's testimony from beyond the grave. The most damning portion came near the end. Vanessa directly addressed Marcus's corruption. "I've documented everything, Marcus. The meetings with Alvarez's people, the offshore accounts, the money to Leah in Connecticut. I even know about the condo in Florida and whoever you're keeping there." Marcus's response: "If you were smart, you'd forget everything you think you know. People who push too hard into things that don't concern them tend to have accidents. That's just how the world works." Listen to those words again. Tend to have accidents. That's not a warning. That's a threat. And less than 3 hours after recording that conversation, Vanessa King would be dead. Some accidents, it turns out, are carefully planned murders disguised as random violence. This recording, combined with the physical evidence, cell tower data, financial irregularities, and Kyle Thorne's testimony about the evidence log, finally convinced District Attorney Eleanor Rivera that they had sufficient cause to arrest the chief of police for his wife's murder. The decision was made. The wheels of justice, which turn slowly but grind exceedingly fine, were about to catch up with Marcus Bailey. The arrest was planned with military precision. They couldn't use Providence PD officers. Too much potential for leaks, too many loyalties that might compromise the operation. Instead, it was coordinated by the state police to avoid interference from officers loyal to Bailey. On a misty Monday morning, exactly 1 week after Vanessa's murder, State Police Captain Rodriguez and his tactical team intercepted Bailey as he left his parents' home. They took him into custody efficiently, professionally, before he could even reach his vehicle. The arrest was deliberately low-key. No media circus, no perp walk for the cameras. Though news would spread rapidly through the city within hours anyway. Bad news always travels fast. Bailey's expression as the handcuffs closed around his wrists was one of genuine shock. Not shock at being suspected, investigators would later conclude, but shock at the realization that his position and connections had failed to protect him, that the invisible shield he'd believed his badge provided had turned out to be made of paper. "This is a mistake that will end careers," Bailey warned Captain Rodriguez, his final attempt at intimidation falling on deaf ears as he was placed in the unmarked police vehicle. Even then, even in handcuffs, he believed his authority still meant something. That's the thing about power. It can make you blind to reality. Make you think you're invincible right up until the moment you discover you're not. The Providence Journal's headline the next morning read simply, "Police Chief Arrested in Wife's Murder," accompanied by Bailey's official department photograph alongside a smiling image of Vanessa from a charity gala the previous year. Two faces, two fates. One who'd sworn to protect and serve, the other who'd trusted him with her life. The story broke like a tsunami through Rhode Island, polarizing the community between those who couldn't believe Bailey capable of such acts and others who had long harbored suspicions about his character and conduct. Inside the Providence Police Department, immediate fractures appeared. Some officers openly questioned the evidence, unable or unwilling to believe their chief could be a murderer. Others, particularly those who had experienced Bailey's arrogance firsthand, expressed grim vindication. They'd seen glimpses of the man behind the badge, the entitled attitude, the subtle abuse of power. And now it all made terrible sense. Acting Chief Jefferson, appointed by the mayor within hours of Bailey's arrest, called an all-hands meeting to address the department's uncertainty. His message was simple but necessary. Their duty remained to the citizens of Providence regardless of personal feelings about the case. The badge doesn't belong to any one person. It belongs to the principle of justice. And justice, real justice, doesn't play favorites based on who's wearing that badge. At the Providence Adult Correctional Institution, Marcus Bailey sat in an isolated cell, the full weight of his predicament becoming increasingly clear as his requests for special treatment were systematically denied. No private cell, no special visitation rights, no deference to his former position. He was just another inmate now, facing murder charges. His attorney, Richard Gould, a high-powered defense lawyer known for representing corrupt officials, visited that afternoon with news that bail had been denied due to flight risk concerns. Bailey had multiple identities, properties in Florida, offshore accounts. Where exactly would he run if given the chance? During their discussion, Bailey maintained his innocence, insisting the evidence had been planted by enemies within the department. Officers jealous of his success. Political rivals. Someone with an axe to grind. Gould listened with practiced patience. He'd heard it all before delivering his professional assessment. The DNA evidence, the recording, the financial trail, and your brother's testimony create a compelling narrative of guilt. If you want any chance of avoiding a life sentence, we need to discuss plea options. Bailey rejected this suggestion outright. Pleading guilty? Admitting defeat? That wasn't who Marcus Bailey was. He'd beaten every challenge in his life through confidence, authority, and the belief that he was smarter than everyone else. Surely he could beat this too. Surely the system he'd manipulated for years would bend one more time in his favor. He was wrong about that too. The web of deception he'd so carefully constructed, the secret families, the hidden money, the protected criminals, the murdered wife, was unraveling thread by thread. And soon, very soon, the world would see Marcus Bailey for exactly what he was. Not the hero he'd pretended to be, but the monster he'd always been beneath that badge. The arraignment the following morning drew unprecedented crowds to the Providence County Courthouse. Protesters and supporters alike gathered on the steps despite the continuing spring rain, their competing signs, "Justice for Vanessa" and "Stand with Chief Bailey," creating a visual representation of a city torn in half. Inside the packed courtroom, Marcus Bailey stood in his orange jumpsuit, the transformation from respected police chief to criminal defendant starkly visible in his disheveled appearance and the dark circles beneath his eyes. When Judge Blackwell read the charges, first-degree murder, embezzlement of federal funds, accepting bribes, obstruction of justice, Bailey's response of "not guilty, Your Honor," was firm, but undermined by the slight tremor in his voice. From the gallery, Vanessa's sister Miranda watched with unwavering focus, her presence a silent reminder of the human cost beyond the legal proceedings and media sensation. This wasn't just another case. This was her sister, her best friend. gone forever because she'd made the mistake of trusting the wrong man. The forensic laboratory at the Rhode Island State Crime Lab hummed with activity as technicians processed the final pieces of physical evidence that would seal Marcus Bailey's fate. Under the meticulous supervision of Dr. Elaine Winters, the state's leading forensic scientist, analysts confirmed what Detective Mitchell had suspected from the beginning. The bullet that killed Vanessa King had been fired from a police-issue Glock with deliberately filed barrel riflings, an attempt to prevent ballistic matching. Someone had taken a file to the inside of that gun barrel, trying to obliterate the unique markings that make every firearm identifiable. But despite this effort, microscopic imperfections in the filing pattern created a signature that, when compared with test firings from Bailey's service weapon, showed a 97% probability of being the same gun. The ballistics match is compelling, but we have something even more definitive, Dr. Winters explained to Mitchell and ADA Evans as they gathered around a high-resolution monitor displaying microscopic images. The forensic team had discovered gunshot residue embedded in the cuff of a jacket recovered from Bailey's parents' home, the place he'd been staying since the murder. This wasn't just any jacket. It was the one Bailey had been wearing in security footage from Boston on the day of the murder, which meant he'd worn it while shooting Vanessa, then continued wearing it while establishing the latter part of his alibi. The arrogance of it was almost breathtaking. The residue pattern matched the specific ammunition used in the murder, creating what Dr. Winters called a direct material connection between the defendant and the act of firing the fatal shot. In plain English, Marcus Bailey had pulled that trigger. The science said so. And science doesn't care about badges or 20 years of service or how many commendations someone has on their wall. Across town, in the secure interview room of the Providence Adult Correctional Institution, Detective Mitchell faced Marcus Bailey and his attorney for what would be their final pretrial interrogation. Bailey's demeanor had changed markedly since his arrest 2 weeks earlier. The commanding presence had diminished, replaced by a calculating weariness as he evaluated each question before responding. Mitchell methodically presented the new forensic findings, watching as Bailey's expression remained fixed in practiced neutrality while his attorney Richard Gould scribbled furious notes. The detective saved the most damaging evidence for last. Cell tower data now definitively placed Bailey's phone at his home during the exact time of the murder, contradicting his alibi of being in Boston. Security camera footage from a Providence bank had captured his department SUV turning onto his street at 2:27 p.m. How do you explain being at your house when Vanessa was killed, despite claiming to be 40 miles away? Mitchell asked, his tone conversational but unyielding. Bailey's response was textbook deflection. Someone must have stolen his vehicle and phone to frame him. A theory that crumbled when Mitchell produced time-stamped footage from a Boston convenience store showing Bailey checking his phone at 4:15 p.m., well after the murder. You can't be in two places at once, and you can't have your phone stolen while simultaneously using it. The lies were piling up, each one more desperate than the last. The interrogation continued for 3 hours, Bailey maintaining his innocence despite the mounting contradictions in his story, until finally Gould ended the session, citing client fatigue. As Bailey was led back to his cell, Mitchell noted how the former chief's shoulders had begun to slump, the first visible sign that he might be recognizing the inevitability of his conviction. Pride goes before the fall, they say, and Marcus Bailey had a long way to fall. The prosecution's case strengthened further when digital forensics finally cracked the password protection on Vanessa's laptop. What they found was remarkable. Detailed records she'd kept of her suspicions about her husband's activities. Photographs of cash Bailey had carelessly left visible in his home office. Screenshots of suspicious text messages she'd found on his phone. A journal documenting unexplained absences and inconsistent explanations that stretched back nearly 2 years. Vanessa King hadn't just been a worried wife. She'd been an investigator, methodically building a case against her own husband. Most damaging was a spreadsheet where Vanessa, who had worked as an accountant before their marriage, had meticulously tracked discrepancies between Bailey's stated income and their actual expenditures. She'd highlighted a shortfall of approximately $200,000, a figure that aligned perfectly with the embezzled federal grant funds identified by forensic accountant Melissa Chun. She was building her own case against him, ADA Evans remarked as she reviewed the files with her prosecution team, her admiration for Vanessa's thoroughness evident. The discovery painted a tragic picture. a woman who had gradually realized the extent of her husband's corruption and infidelity. A woman who had made the fatal decision to confront him with evidence rather than silently filing for divorce and disappearing into the night. She'd chosen the harder path, the righteous path, and it had cost her everything. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Detective Mitchell received a call from Leah Greer, Bailey's mistress from Connecticut. She'd seen news reports about the third woman in Florida, Cassandra Wilson, and wanted to cooperate with prosecutors. The discovery that she wasn't Bailey's only secret had shattered whatever loyalty she'd felt toward him. In a 6-hour interview at her modest apartment in Hartford, Greer described how Bailey had initially presented himself as a widower with a demanding job that required frequent travel. Only after she became pregnant did he reveal his true identity, spinning a story about a loveless marriage he was planning to leave. She provided text messages showing Bailey's increasing financial promises in the weeks before the murder, culminating in that $50,000 transfer the day before Vanessa's death. Money she now believed was meant to buy her silence. Most shockingly, Greer revealed that Bailey had asked her to provide him an alibi for March 15th if ever questioned. He'd told her he was preparing for a corruption investigation, which was true, just not in the way he'd implied, and needed to establish his whereabouts. He called me that afternoon around 3:30, specifically asking me to remember we'd spoken at that time, Greer explained, her voice tight with the realization of how she'd been manipulated. It was premeditation at its finest, creating witnesses, establishing timelines, all while his wife's body was still warm on the kitchen floor. As the investigation expanded beyond the murder to encompass Bailey's corruption, Detective Mitchell and a specialized anti-corruption unit uncovered a network of compromised officers who had helped Bailey protect the Alvarez drug organization. Officer Raymond Donovan confessed to redirecting patrols away from Alvarez territory in exchange for cash payments authorized by Bailey. Evidence technician Sarah Harding admitted to deliberately contaminating evidence from raids that inadvertently captured Alvarez associates. These officers, facing their own criminal charges, became cooperative witnesses describing how Bailey had systematically identified vulnerable department members, those with gambling debts, medical bills, or other financial pressures, and recruited them into his protection scheme. Bailey didn't just corrupt individuals. He corrupted the system itself, Mitchell explained during a joint briefing with state and federal authorities who had now joined the investigation. The detective outlined how Bailey had redirected a $200,000 community policing grant, money intended for youth outreach programs, into a series of shell companies ostensibly providing consulting services, but which ultimately funneled the money back to Bailey through offshore accounts. This financial trail connected directly to the Providence Restoration Project, a community initiative chaired by City Councilman Victor Diaz, who was now also under investigation for his role in approving invoices for services never rendered. What had started as a murder investigation had expanded into a conspiracy that threatened public trust in multiple institutions. The rot ran deeper than anyone had initially suspected. The final piece of the prosecution's case fell into place when forensic technicians recovered deleted text messages from Bailey's phone. Among them were exchanges with Alvarez organization Lieutenant Miguel Suarez, arranging a meeting on March 14th, the day before Vanessa's murder. Surveillance footage from a parking garage near the Providence Place Mall confirmed this meeting took place, showing Bailey receiving an envelope from Suarez before they parted ways. Financial records indicated that $75,000 was deposited into Bailey's secret account later that day, with $50,000 transferred to Leah Greer the following morning. This timeline suggested to prosecutors that Bailey had accelerated his plans to eliminate Vanessa after receiving this payment, perhaps fearing her discoveries would expose not just his infidelity, but the entire criminal enterprise he had built. The pressure was mounting, the walls closing in, and Vanessa was the one person who could bring it all crashing down. For weeks after Vanessa's murder, ADA Sophia Evans stood before Judge Blackwell in a pretrial hearing, outlining the state's case against Marcus Bailey in clear, methodical terms that left no doubt about the strength of their evidence. She described how Bailey had signed out police-issue zip ties the day before the murder, used his service weapon to kill his wife after staging a break-in, attempted to establish an alibi through carefully planned movements, transferred funds to secure the silence of his mistress, Evans connected these actions to Bailey's long-term corruption and the immediate threat posed by Vanessa's discoveries, creating what she called a perfect storm of motive, opportunity, and damning forensic evidence. When the prosecutor concluded her presentation, the courtroom remained silent for several moments. The weight of Bailey's betrayal, of both his wife and his oath as a police officer, hung palpably in the air. You could feel it pressing down on everyone present. This wasn't just about one man's crimes. This was about the violation of trust that makes society possible. When those sworn to protect become predators, something fundamental breaks. Defense attorney Richard Gould attempted to challenge the search warrants and seek exclusion of certain evidence, but his motions were systematically denied. Judge Blackwell found the prosecution had established proper probable cause at each investigative step. She set a trial date for early November, allowing both sides adequate time to prepare while still ensuring the high-profile case would move forward without undue delay. As Bailey was led from the courtroom back to his cell, he locked eyes briefly with his brother Kyle, who sat in the gallery in civilian clothes. Kyle had taken leave from the department following his decision to testify against Marcus. No words were exchanged, but the gulf between them, one brother who had chosen truth over family, the other who had betrayed every principle he'd sworn to uphold, seemed unbridgeable in that momentary connection. Some betrayals are too profound to ever fully heal. The media frenzy surrounding the case intensified as pretrial proceedings continued. National news outlets descended on Providence to cover what was being called the most shocking case of police corruption in Rhode Island history. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, the police department, and the homes of key witnesses, creating a circus-like atmosphere that added to the pressure on everyone involved. Detective Mitchell maintained a strict policy of limited commentary, providing only factual updates approved by the DA's office, while focusing his energy on ensuring the investigation remained meticulous and unimpeachable. He knew from experience that high-profile cases were won or lost in these crucial pretrial months, when evidence could be overlooked or witness cooperation could waver under the glare of publicity. In the quiet of his office late one evening, Mitchell reviewed the case files one more time, paying particular attention to the evidence that would form the backbone of their prosecution. The audio recording of Bailey threatening Vanessa, the DNA under her fingernails, the cell tower data placing him at the murder scene, the financial records showing motive, Kyle Thorne's testimony regarding the evidence log. Each element alone was compelling. Together, they formed a prosecutorial narrative that would be difficult for any defense to overcome. The detective closed the file with a sense of grim satisfaction, not in the downfall of a once-respected colleague, but in the knowledge that Vanessa King would receive the justice she deserved. As he prepared to leave, Mitchell's phone rang with news that would add yet another layer to their case. Cassandra Wilson, Bailey's secret partner in Florida, had come forward after learning about the case on national news. She was offering evidence of additional financial crimes and her own statement about Bailey's controlling behavior and threats. The pieces kept falling into place. Bailey's carefully constructed world of deception was collapsing around him, one revelation at a time. And soon, very soon, he would face a jury of his peers who would decide whether a badge and 20 years of service could somehow excuse the murder of an innocent woman whose only crime had been discovering the truth. Vanessa King's voice, preserved in that cloud recording, would speak from beyond the grave. Her meticulous financial records would testify to her courage and determination. Her broken fingernails would tell the story of her final, desperate fight for survival. And Marcus Bailey, who had believed himself above the law, was about to learn that justice, when it finally arrives, doesn't care about your badge. It only cares about the truth. The trial was coming. And with it, the reckoning Bailey had thought he'd escaped. November arrived in Providence with that particular New England chill that seeps into your bones and won't let go. The Providence County Courthouse stood against the gray sky like a monument to judgment itself, its neoclassical columns gleaming as media trucks lined the surrounding streets and demonstrators gathered with their competing signs. Inside Courtroom 3A, the air hummed with tension, that electric feeling you get when everyone knows they're about to witness something historic. Judge Harriet Blackwell called the Commonwealth of Rhode Island versus Marcus Bailey to order, her authoritative voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. Marcus Bailey sat at the defense table in a carefully selected navy suit. No tie, on his attorney's advice, meant to appear more approachable, less authoritarian. His expression was neutral, but his eyes constantly scanned the room, assessing threats and opportunities with the tactical awareness that had once made him an effective police officer. Now it just made him look calculating, guilty, even, though the jury had been instructed not to read anything into a defendant's demeanor. ADA Sophia Evans arranged her notes at the prosecution table with precise movements. Her burgundy blazer and black pants, chosen specifically to project authority without ostentation. Her focus was absolute as she prepared to present the state's case against a man who had betrayed both his marriage vows and his oath of office. This was her moment, the culmination of months of work, hundreds of hours reviewing evidence, preparing witnesses, anticipating every possible defense strategy. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about a man who believed the laws he enforced didn't apply to him. Evans began, her clear voice carrying to every corner of the hushed courtroom. She moved to stand directly before the jury box, making eye contact with each juror in turn. Personal connection matters in trials. You're not just presenting facts, you're telling a story. And people need to believe the storyteller before they'll believe the story. Evans methodically outlined how Marcus Bailey had lived a life of deception, embezzling federal funds meant for youth programs, accepting bribes from drug traffickers to protect their operations, maintaining multiple secret families across 3 states, until his wife Vanessa discovered evidence of his crimes and became a threat to his freedom and carefully constructed false reality. The prosecutor detailed the premeditation evident in Bailey's actions, signing out zip ties from the evidence room the day before the murder, creating an alibi through a Boston meeting, staging a break-in at his own home, using his service weapon to kill Vanessa after she'd uploaded damning evidence to her cloud storage. The evidence will show that Chief Bailey didn't just betray his wife's trust, Evans said, her voice gaining intensity. He betrayed the trust of every citizen of Providence by using his badge as both a shield for his crimes and a weapon against those who might expose him. She paused, letting the words sink in before returning to her seat. Several jurors scribbled notes. Bailey maintained his stoic expression, but you could see the tension in his jaw. Defense attorney Richard Gould rose next, his imposing height and silver hair lending gravitas as he addressed the jury with the confident ease of someone who defended powerful clients for 3 decades. What the prosecution has presented is a theory built on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of witnesses with clear motivations to lie, Gould asserted, his resonant baritone creating an immediate contrast with Evans's more measured tones. The defense attorney painted Bailey as a dedicated public servant being framed by disgruntled officers and spurned mistresses. He suggested the real killers, drug dealers Bailey had been secretly investigating, had murdered Vanessa and planted evidence to frame the chief. This alternative narrative, though contradicted by substantial physical evidence, was delivered with such conviction that several jurors nodded along, particularly when Gould emphasized Bailey's 20-year record of service and the medals he'd received for bravery early in his career. The state must prove their case beyond reasonable doubt, and when you examine their evidence carefully, you will find it riddled with inconsistencies and assumptions, Gould concluded, placing a paternal hand briefly on Bailey's shoulder before returning to the defense table. The gesture was calculated, humanizing the defendant, reminding the jury that this was a real person, not just a criminal in a suit. The contrasting opening statements had set the stage for what promised to be a contentious trial. Evans would build a methodical, evidence-based case showing motive, opportunity, and means. Gould would attack witness credibility and offer alternative explanations for the physical evidence. Classic prosecution versus defense. Truth versus reasonable doubt. Judge Blackwell instructed the jury to keep open minds until all evidence had been presented, then called for the prosecution's first witness, Dr. Elaine Winters, the medical examiner, who would establish the clinical details of Vanessa's death before the more emotionally charged testimony to follow. With 22 years of experience and over 400 homicide examinations to her credit, Dr. Winters provided dispassionate testimony about Vanessa King's final moments, supported by autopsy photographs shown only to the jury due to their graphic nature. The medical examiner described the single gunshot wound to the chest that had caused death within minutes. The defensive wounds on Vanessa's hands indicating she tried to protect herself. The bruising patterns on her wrists consistent with restraint by zip ties before the fatal shot. Under Evans's careful questioning, Dr. Winters explained that gunshot residue patterns indicated the shooter stood approximately 3 feet from Vanessa, a distance suggesting familiarity rather than the panicked shot of a startled intruder. When asked to estimate time of death, Dr. Winters provided the critical window of 2:30 to 3 p.m. on March 15th, directly contradicting Bailey's alibi of being in Boston during those hours. This was foundational testimony, establishing not just how Vanessa died, but when, and by extension, who could have killed her. During cross-examination, Gould attempted to introduce doubt about the time of death estimate, suggesting variables like room temperature and Vanessa's medical conditions could have affected the calculation. Dr. Winters calmly refuted each suggestion, explaining that she'd accounted for all relevant factors and that the narrowed time window was supported by multiple physiological indicators. When Gould pivoted to questioning whether the defensive wounds could have resulted from an earlier unrelated incident, Dr. Winters definitively stated that the wound coloration and cellular response indicated they occurred contemporaneously with the fatal injury. The medical examiner's unflappable demeanor and clear expertise left her testimony largely intact, providing the prosecution with a solid foundation of scientific evidence upon which to build their case. Juries love experts, people who can say definitively, "This is what happened, and here's the science to prove it." Dr. Winters had done exactly that. The courtroom atmosphere intensified when Detective Andre Mitchell took the stand. His testimony represented the backbone of the investigation that had led to Bailey's arrest. Mitchell walked the jury through the initial crime scene observations, the supposedly ransacked home, where valuable electronics remained untouched, the precision with which certain rooms had been disturbed while others remained pristine, the forced entry marks on the back door that forensic analysis had determined were made from the inside rather than outside. The detective's methodical presentation style mirrored the careful approach he'd taken to the investigation itself, building a compelling case piece by piece rather than relying on dramatic revelations. When Evans presented the evidence log showing Bailey had signed out zip ties identical to those used to restrain Vanessa, Mitchell explained how this discovery by Kyle Thorne had represented the first substantial break in the case. You could see some jurors lean forward, paying closer attention. This was getting interesting. "Detective Mitchell, did you recover any surveillance footage relevant to this investigation?" Evans asked, transitioning to evidence that directly challenged Bailey's alibi. Mitchell described the security camera footage from both a Providence bank, showing Bailey's department SUV turning onto his street at 2:27 p.m., directly within the time of death window, and from a Boston convenience store showing Bailey checking his phone at 4:15 p.m., contradicting his claim that his phone had been stolen. Then came the cell tower data. Mitchell presented visualization graphics showing Bailey's movements on March 15th. The phone traveling from Boston toward Providence around 1:40 p.m., arriving near the Bailey residence at approximately 2:25 p.m., remaining stationary until 3:15 p.m., then moving back toward Boston. This technical evidence directly placed Bailey at the scene during the critical window when Vanessa was killed. Hard to argue with cell towers. They don't lie. They don't have motivations or biases. They just record where phones are. Under Gould's aggressive cross-examination, Mitchell maintained his professional composure. He conceded potential limitations of individual pieces of evidence while emphasizing how the totality created a coherent narrative of guilt. "Isn't it possible that someone else could have taken the chief's vehicle and phone?" Gould demanded, his tone suggesting this alternative explanation was obvious. Mitchell acknowledged the theoretical possibility, then methodically dismantled it. Security footage showing Bailey with his phone before and after the murder. The department SUV's GPS tracking system placing it at his home. And most damning, Bailey's fingerprints on the interior driver's side door handle with time-specific pollen particles matching those present at the crime scene. Each answer was a nail in the defense's coffin. The prosecution shifted to financial motive with testimony from forensic accountant Melissa Chun. She presented a devastating analysis of Bailey's secret financial life, walking the jury through deposits totaling more than $200,000 into Bailey's hidden accounts over 18 months. Regular transfers to support his relationships with Leah Greer in Connecticut and Cassandra Wilson in Florida. Luxury purchases including a boat, vacation properties, expensive jewelry. Using charts and bank records projected on screens visible to the jury, Chen demonstrated how these expenditures vastly exceeded Bailey's legitimate income as police chief. The financial pressure had intensified when Vanessa began questioning discrepancies in their joint accounts. Chen then traced the $50,000 transfer to Leah Greer made the day before Vanessa's murder, suggesting this payment represented both ongoing financial support and potential insurance against Greer's testimony. Based on your professional expertise, what conclusions did you draw about Chief Bailey's financial activities? Evans asked, bringing this complex testimony to its critical point. Chen responded with devastating clarity. The financial patterns demonstrate systematic criminal activity, including embezzlement, money laundering, and structuring of transactions to avoid detection, creating a financial house of cards that would collapse if exposed, as Ms. King was preparing to do based on her own financial records. During cross-examination, Gould tried to suggest alternative sources for the funds: family gifts, legitimate investments, consulting work. Each suggestion wilted under Chen's precise rebuttals referencing specific transactions and timing. The financial picture painted for the jury was crystal clear. Bailey had substantial monetary motives to silence his wife before she could expose his crimes. When your entire life is built on illegal money, and someone threatens to expose that, you'll do anything to protect it, even murder. The fourth day of trial brought the most anticipated testimony. Kyle Thorne, Bailey's younger brother, and the officer whose discovery of the evidence log had broken the case open. Kyle entered the courtroom without looking toward the defense table where his brother sat. His police training was evident in his erect posture and disciplined movements, despite the obvious emotional strain visible in his face. This wasn't easy for him. You could see it in every step he took toward the witness stand. After establishing Kyle's credentials, 8 years with Providence PD, for commendations for exemplary service, and his relationship to the defendant, Evans gently led him through the events following Vanessa's murder. The discovery of the evidence log showing Marcus had signed out zip ties the day before the killing. The internal struggle between family loyalty and professional duty. Kyle's voice occasionally faltered, but his resolution remained clear. I knew what finding his signature meant, Kyle testified, finally looking directly at his brother for the first time since entering the courtroom. It meant that either Marcus had to have a perfect explanation for why those exact zip ties were used to restrain Vanessa, or, he paused, the weight of what he was about to say visible in his expression, or my brother was involved in her death. The courtroom fell completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Kyle described how he'd initially hoped for an innocent explanation, but found his brother's responses evasive when questioned. How he'd ultimately made the painful decision to bring the evidence log to Detective Mitchell. As he recounted this moment of choice between truth and family, several jurors visibly reacted. One wiped away tears. Another nodded in apparent respect for the difficult decision. Throughout this testimony, Marcus Bailey stared at his brother with an expression that shifted between betrayal and cold calculation, his right hand clenched so tightly his knuckles whitened. Gould's cross-examination of Kyle Thorne was among the most aggressive of the trial. He attempted to portray Kyle as jealous of his more successful brother, resentful of living in Marcus's shadow within the department. The defense attorney referenced childhood incidents and professional disagreements, suggesting Kyle had seized on the evidence log as an opportunity to bring down his brother rather than protect him. It was brutal to watch, taking someone's most painful decision and twisting it into something ugly. Kyle absorbed these attacks with remarkable composure. He acknowledged past tensions while firmly maintaining that his actions were driven solely by professional duty and the evidence before him. When Gould demanded to know why Kyle hadn't approached Marcus privately before going to investigators, Kyle's response resonated throughout the courtroom. Because I'm a police officer first and a brother second. And no one, not even family, should be above the law. Those words hung in the air like a benediction, or maybe an indictment, depending on where you stood on the question of loyalty versus justice. But looking at the jurors' faces, you could see which side was winning. Truth, justice, the law. Those principles still meant something, even when following them tears your family apart. The prosecution's case strengthened further with testimony from Rebecca Chun, Bailey's former administrative assistant. She described the chief's pattern of redirecting patrols away from Alvarez organization territory. blocking certain arrest reports, holding unlogged meetings with known associates of the drug trafficking group. Chun presented her contemporaneous notes documenting these suspicious activities, explaining she'd initially believed there must be legitimate law enforcement reasons until accumulating evidence convinced her otherwise. Her testimony directly connected Bailey's financial motives to his corrupt activities as police chief, showing how he'd systematically abused his position to protect criminal enterprises in exchange for payments. When Evans asked why Chun had finally come forward, her answer was simple but powerful. Because what happened to Vanessa King showed me that staying silent wasn't just about my job anymore. It was about life and death. As the first week of trial concluded, the prosecution had established a compelling narrative of Bailey's corruption, motive, and opportunity, supported by both physical evidence and credible witness testimony. Evans had deliberately paced her case to build progressively, starting with clinical facts of the murder itself, then establishing Bailey's presence at the scene contrary to his alibi, followed by financial motives driving his actions. Finally, the pattern of corruption that Vanessa had discovered. The weekend break would allow jurors to process this information before the prosecution presented its most emotionally impactful witnesses the following week, Leah Greer and Cassandra Wilson, whose testimony would reveal the full extent of Bailey's deception, and the digital evidence specialist who would play Vanessa's damning audio recording for the courtroom. That moment when a dead woman would speak, her voice preserved in the digital ether, testifying against the man who'd tried to silence her forever. As spectators filed out Friday afternoon, the general consensus among legal observers was that the prosecution had built a formidable case. Though Bailey's defense team would have ample opportunity to present alternative explanations when they took control of the courtroom, the trial was far from over. But the momentum, the weight of evidence and testimony, was clearly moving in one direction, toward conviction, toward justice, toward the moment when Marcus Bailey would finally face consequences for believing his badge made him untouchable. The question wasn't whether he'd killed Vanessa King. The evidence had already answered that. The question was whether 12 ordinary citizens would have the courage to look a police chief in the eye and say, "You're guilty, and you're going to prison for the rest of your life." Monday morning brought renewed tension to Courtroom 3A as the prosecution prepared to present its most damning evidence. The audio recording Vanessa King had uploaded to cloud storage hours before her death. IT specialist Aaron Michaels took the stand, his credentials as a digital forensics expert established through 10 minutes of detailed questioning about his education, training, and experience recovering digital evidence in over 300 criminal investigations. This was crucial groundwork. Before a jury hears explosive evidence, they need to trust the person presenting it. Michaels explained how investigators had discovered the encrypted file in Vanessa's cloud storage, the rigorous process used to verify its authenticity, and the timestamp data confirming it had been recorded and uploaded at 1:47 p.m. on March 15th, just hours before her estimated time of death. Mr. Michaels, did you prepare a transcript of this recording to assist the jury in following along? ADA Evans asked, her tone deliberately matter-of-fact despite the dramatic evidence about to be presented. When Michaels confirmed he had, court officers distributed transcript copies to each juror. The courtroom fell into complete silence. That heavy, breathless silence that happens when everyone knows they're about to hear something that matters, something that can't be unheard. As Evans asked for the audio to be played, even the usual shuffling of papers and shifting in seats suspended. Vanessa's voice came through the courtroom speakers clearly, steady but with underlying tension. "Marcus, I found the bank statements. I know about the money. $200,000 from the federal grant that never went to the youth programs." The recording continued for 7 minutes and 18 seconds, capturing an increasingly heated exchange as Marcus first denied any wrongdoing, then attempted to gaslight Vanessa by suggesting she was misinterpreting legitimate transactions. Finally, when those tactics failed, he shifted to veiled threats. Vanessa mentioned contacting journalist Thomas Merrick, and you could hear the menace creep into Marcus's voice. "You have no idea who you're threatening. No one will believe you over me. I run this department, and I decide what's investigated and what isn't." Throughout the playback, the real Marcus Bailey sat rigid at the defense table, his expression frozen in a mask of neutrality that nevertheless failed to hide the muscle twitching in his jaw. Several jurors glanced between the defendant and the speakers, making the connection between the threatening voice on the recording and the man now on trial for silencing that threat permanently. It's one thing to read about threats in a police report. It's another thing entirely to hear them in the dead woman's own recording, her fear palpable even through courtroom speakers. The most damaging portion came near the end. Vanessa directly addressed Marcus's corruption. "I've documented everything, Marcus. The meetings with Alvarez's people, the offshore accounts, the money to Leia in Connecticut. I even know about the condo in Florida and whoever you're keeping there." Bailey's response was chilling in its calculated menace. "If you were smart, you'd forget everything you think you know. People who push too hard into things that don't concern them tend to have accidents. That's just how the world works." The recording ended with Vanessa stating firmly, "I'm meeting with the attorney tomorrow and the journalist tonight," followed by the sound of a door slamming. As the final seconds of silence played out, several jurors visibly reacted. One woman covered her mouth. Another took deep breaths. A middle-aged man shook his head slowly while staring directly at Bailey. The emotional impact was undeniable. This wasn't just evidence anymore. It was a woman's final stand for truth, preserved for posterity. Defense attorney Richard Gould immediately objected to the recording's admissibility, arguing that its authenticity couldn't be verified and that it potentially violated marital privilege. Judge Blackwell, having anticipated this challenge, had already reviewed extensive briefs from both sides and ruled that the recording was admissible both as evidence of motive and under the crime-fraud exception to marital privilege. Communications in furtherance of a crime aren't protected, not even between spouses. Gould's cross-examination of Michaels attempted to sow doubt about the recording's integrity, suggesting it could have been edited or manipulated. But the IT specialist systematically dismantled these claims, explaining the digital forensic markers that would have revealed any tampering. The defense's challenges only served to reinforce the recording's authenticity in many jurors' minds. When you try too hard to discredit something and fail, you actually make it more credible. Following the explosive impact of the audio recording, the prosecution called Leia Greer to the stand, the first of Bailey's secret partners to testify about his pattern of deception and financial manipulation. Greer, a petite woman in her early 30s who nervously adjusted her glasses throughout her testimony, described meeting Bailey 3 years earlier when he presented himself as a widower with a demanding job requiring frequent travel. She explained how their relationship had progressed rapidly, with Bailey moving her into a Connecticut apartment he paid for after she became pregnant with their now 2-year-old son. Greer's voice wavered as she recounted discovering Bailey's true marital status months later. How his financial support and promises of eventually divorcing Vanessa had convinced her to maintain the relationship. It was a pattern of manipulation that established Bailey's practice of using money to control those around him, making people dependent, then using that dependency as leverage. "Ms. Greer, did the defendant contact you regarding March 15th, the day Vanessa King was murdered?" Evans asked, guiding the testimony toward its most relevant aspects. Greer described how Bailey had called her that afternoon around 3:30, specifically asking her to remember they had spoken at that time, if ever questioned. She further testified about the $50,000 transfer Bailey had made to her account the day before the murder, an amount far larger than his typical monthly support payments. When Evans asked about her understanding of this payment now, Greer responded with painful clarity. "I believe he was buying my silence and setting up financial security for our son because he knew what he was planning to do to his wife." This statement caused Bailey to visibly react for the first time, leaning forward to whisper urgently to his attorney while casting a betrayed glance at his former mistress. The mask was slipping. The control was cracking. Under cross-examination, Gould attempted to portray Greer as a scorned woman seeking revenge against Bailey for his relationships with other women, particularly Cassandra Wilson in Florida. This line of questioning backfired when Greer acknowledged her hurt and anger upon discovering Bailey's multiple deceptions, but maintained that her testimony was motivated by truth rather than vengeance. "I have to look my son in the eye someday and explain who his father is," Greer said, her voice finding strength. "I don't want to add more lies to what Marcus has already created." This response resonated with several jurors who had previously appeared skeptical of her testimony, demonstrating Evans's strategic wisdom in addressing Greer's potential credibility issues directly rather than allowing the defense to exploit them. Sometimes the best defense against an attack is admitting vulnerability up front, making it part of your story instead of letting it become a weapon against you. The prosecution's case gained further momentum with testimony from forensic cell phone analyst Terrence Wong. Using colorful visualization displays projected on screens, Wong showed how Bailey's cell phone connected to towers tracking a journey from Boston toward Providence around 1:40 p.m., arriving near the Bailey residence at approximately 2:25 p.m., precisely within the medical examiner's estimated time of death window. The phone remained stationary until 3:15 p.m., then moved back toward Boston. Wong further testified that data from the phone showed active use during this period. Text messages sent. A phone call to Leah Greer at 3:30 p.m. This proved it wasn't simply an abandoned device. It was being actively used by someone familiar with Bailey's password and contacts. Based on your analysis, is there any technological explanation for how this phone could have been in Providence while Chief Bailey was in Boston, as he claimed? Evans asked, driving home the critical point. Wong explained that the combination of GPS data, tower connections, and active use patterns created an electronic signature that, in his expert opinion, could only be explained by Bailey himself being physically present with the phone in Providence during the time of the murder. Technology doesn't lie. It can't be intimidated or manipulated. It just records reality, indifferent to whose reality it destroys. During cross-examination, Gould suggested alternative scenarios involving phone cloning or theft, but Wong methodically eliminated these possibilities. The biometric login requirements. Pattern of use consistent with Bailey's typical behavior. Precise correlation between the phone's movements and security camera footage of Bailey's department SUV at multiple locations. Each alternative explanation demolished by facts. The prosecution's case reached another emotional peak with testimony from Cassandra Wilson, the woman Bailey had been secretly supporting in Florida while maintaining relationships with both his wife and Leah Greer. Wilson, more composed than Greer but visibly nervous, described meeting Bailey at a law enforcement conference in Miami 3 years earlier. She believed he was separated from his wife and in the process of divorce, the same lie he told everyone else. She detailed how Bailey had purchased an expensive condominium for her through his shell company, Coastal Horizons, LLC, making monthly visits that coincided with what he told Vanessa were law enforcement training events. Wilson's testimony established not just another layer of Bailey's deception, but provided crucial financial evidence. She shared recordings of phone conversations in which Bailey explicitly discussed using drug money and embezzled funds to purchase Florida properties as investments. He told me the money came from arrangements with business associates in Providence and that it needed to be cleaned through real estate, Wilson testified, referring to notes she'd made after becoming suspicious about the source of Bailey's apparent wealth. Money laundering, in plain English. Taking dirty money and making it look clean by running it through legitimate businesses and property purchases. She explained how she discovered his true marital status and the existence of Leah Greer after finding a child's drawing signed to Daddy from Tyler in Bailey's briefcase. This discovery had led to bitter arguments, but as with Greer, more financial promises maintained her silence. Wilson's testimony painted Bailey as a calculating manipulator who used money derived from criminal activities to maintain multiple secret lives, creating an unsustainable web of deception that began to collapse when Vanessa discovered financial irregularities. When Evans asked why she had come forward, Wilson's answer was simple but devastating. Because I realized I was living on blood money, and I couldn't look at myself in the mirror anymore. Sometimes it takes a tragedy to make people see what they should have recognized all along. That the luxury they're enjoying came at someone else's expense. Sometimes at someone else's life. The prosecution's scientific evidence continued with testimony from firearms expert Dr. William Chen. Using magnified images projected for the jury, he demonstrated how the bullet recovered from Vanessa's body matched Bailey's service weapon despite attempts to obscure the ballistic markings through filing. Dr. Chun explained how microscopic imperfections in the filing pattern created a unique signature that, when compared with test firings from Bailey's service weapon, showed a 97% probability of being the same gun. The expert further testified about gunshot residue found embedded in the cuff of Bailey's jacket, the same jacket he'd been wearing in security footage from Boston on the day of the murder. The residue matched the specific ammunition used in the murder. In your expert opinion, Dr. Chun, could these ballistic matches and residue patterns have resulted from coincidence or from another weapon? Evans asked, framing the question to address potential defense arguments. Chin's response was unequivocal. The statistical probability of another weapon creating this exact pattern of markings, combined with the specific composition of the gunshot residue matching department-issued ammunition, is less than 1 in 10 million. In practical terms, these are definitive matches. Science speaking with absolute certainty. No equivocation. No maybes. Just facts. As the second week of trial progressed, the prosecution presented a series of witnesses who filled in crucial details. Crime scene technicians testified about evidence suggesting the break-in had been staged. The elderly neighbor who documented seeing Bailey's distinctive black SUV with the broken tail light arriving at his home at 2:27 p.m. provided compelling eyewitness testimony. Officers Raymond Donovan and Sarah Harding, who had accepted bribes to protect the Alvarez drug organization, testified about Bailey's systematic corruption of the department. The prosecution's case approached its conclusion with testimony from journalist Thomas Merrick, who had received Vanessa's email just hours before her murder with the subject line, "Police corruption evidence, urgent." The email contained no attachments. Vanessa had been killed before she could send them, but Merrick's testimony established that she'd been actively seeking to expose her husband's corruption immediately before she was killed. The timing was damning. She reaches out to a journalist. Hours later, she's dead. That's not coincidence. That's motive and murder converging in the most tragic way possible. In a strategic move that surprised many observers, ADA Evans announced the prosecution would rest its case after calling one final witness, Eleanor Vance, Vanessa's mother. The elderly woman took the stand with dignity despite her obvious grief. A photo of her daughter at her college graduation held carefully in her hands throughout her brief testimony. Evans asked only a few questions, establishing the close relationship between mother and daughter, how Vanessa had confided her growing concerns about Bailey's unexplained finances in the weeks before her death. Eleanor described her last conversation with Vanessa, just 2 days before the murder, in which her daughter had seemed simultaneously determined and frightened about decisions she needed to make. She told me, "Mom, I have to do what's right, even if it's hard," Eleanor testified, her voice steady despite the tears on her face. "Those were the last words my daughter ever said to me." This poignant testimony provided a humanizing conclusion to the prosecution's case, reminding the jury that beyond the technical evidence and legal arguments was a real woman whose life had been cut short because she chose to stand against corruption. As Eleanor Vance left the witness stand, she paused briefly beside the defense table, looking directly at Marcus Bailey for the first time since the trial began. No words were exchanged, but the moment, a grieving mother facing her daughter's killer, created a powerful image that seemed to affect even Bailey, who lowered his eyes in a rare display of discomfort. With this emotional punctuation mark, ADA Sophia Evans formally rested the state's case against Marcus Bailey. She presented a comprehensive narrative of corruption, deception, and murder, supported by physical evidence, expert testimony, financial records, and damning recordings in the victim's own voice. Judge Blackwell adjourned court for the day, informing the jury that the defense would begin presenting its case the following morning. As spectators filed out, legal observers noted the uphill battle facing Bailey's defense team. The prosecution had methodically built a case that established motive, opportunity, and means while systematically dismantling potential alternative explanations. Defense attorney Richard Gould huddled with his client in the emptying courtroom, their animated discussion suggesting strategic disagreements about how to proceed. The challenge before them was daunting. Create reasonable doubt in the face of overwhelming evidence, including Bailey's own voice threatening his wife on a recording made hours before her death. Some cases are winnable, some aren't, and everyone in that courtroom, including Marcus Bailey, was beginning to understand which category this one fell into. As court officers prepared to return Bailey to detention, the former police chief's confident facade had visibly eroded, replaced by the grim recognition that his freedom, and potentially his life, hung in the balance of what would unfold in the coming days. The prosecution had told their story. Now it was the defense's turn, and everyone was waiting to see if Richard Gould could pull off a miracle. Because that's what it would take at this point. Nothing less than a miracle. The defense of Marcus Bailey began with a strategic pivot that signaled attorney Richard Gould's recognition of the prosecution's overwhelming case. Rather than continuing to maintain Bailey's complete absence from the crime scene, a position now demolished by cell tower data, security footage, and eyewitness testimony, Gould's opening statement acknowledged that Bailey had indeed returned home briefly during the time window established by the evidence. But, he claimed, Bailey had found Vanessa already dead, killed by drug dealers she'd contacted while investigating his finances. Chief Bailey panicked and made the catastrophic mistake of staging the scene to look like a robbery, fearing he would be blamed due to their marital problems. Gould explained, his tone somber as he presented this modified narrative to the visibly skeptical jury. This radical shift in defense strategy represented a calculated gamble, conceding Bailey's presence at the scene while offering an alternative explanation for the murder itself, attempting to reduce potential charges from first-degree murder to tampering with evidence and obstruction of justice. It was a Hail Mary pass. Everyone could see it, including the jurors. The first defense witness, psychologist Dr. Nathan Phillips, testified about police stress syndrome and the psychological pressures faced by law enforcement officers, particularly those in leadership positions. Phillips described how these stressors could lead to impaired judgment and decision-making during crisis situations, implying that Bailey's actions in staging the crime scene were panic-driven rather than calculated attempts to cover up his own crime. It was interesting, probably even true to some extent. But did it explain signing out zip ties the day before? Did it explain the $50,000 transfer to his mistress? Did it explain that audio recording where he threatened Vanessa? During cross-examination, ADA Evans methodically dismantled this narrative by walking Dr. Phillips through the timeline of Bailey's actions. The signing out of zip ties the day before, the creation of an alibi, the detailed staging of the break-in, the careful disposal of evidence. After each step, she asked whether these appeared consistent with panic-driven behavior or methodical planning. Phillips grudgingly conceded that many of Bailey's actions suggested premeditation rather than panic, particularly when Evans presented evidence that Bailey had researched undetectable poisons on his department computer 3 weeks before ultimately shooting Vanessa. That's not panic. That's planning. That's murder with malice aforethought. The defense strategy suffered another setback when their ballistics expert, Dr. James Renfield, was forced under cross-examination to acknowledge that while ballistic science has margins of error, the specific evidence in this case, including the gunshot residue on Bailey's jacket cuff, created a compelling connection between the defendant and the murder weapon. Evans's preparation was evident as she confronted Renfield with his own published articles affirming the reliability of the same ballistic matching techniques he was now attempting to question, creating an uncomfortable contradiction that visibly affected his credibility with the jury. When Renfield attempted to suggest the residue could have transferred to Bailey's jacket during routine firearms practice, Evans produced department records showing Bailey hadn't attended the shooting range in over 3 months. Each alternative explanation methodically neutralized, each defense theory systematically demolished. You could almost feel the case slipping away from Gould's grasp, one failed witness at a time. In a move that surprised many observers, the defense called Bailey's father, Frank Thorne, to testify about his son's character and dedication to law enforcement. The elder Thorne, still imposing despite his 70 years, spoke with emotional conviction about Marcus's childhood dreams of following in his footsteps, his stellar early career, his commitment to the Providence community. "My son is many things, but he is not a murderer," Thorne stated firmly, his weathered face set with determination as he looked directly at the jury. This character testimony aimed to humanize Bailey and remind jurors of his decades of service before the allegations of corruption. The strategy showed some effect on certain jurors, particularly older men who seemed moved by the father's obvious pain and unwavering belief in his son. Family loyalty is powerful. A father's love for his child, even more so. But is it enough to overcome DNA evidence, cell tower data, and a dead woman's recording? During cross-examination, Evans gently but firmly questioned Frank Thorne about specific aspects of his son's behavior. The unexplained wealth, the multiple secret families, the documented meetings with known criminals. "Mr. Thorne, as a former sheriff with an exemplary record, would you have tolerated these behaviors in any officer under your command?" Evans asked, her tone respectful but the question devastating. Frank's hesitation before answering spoke volumes. The silence stretched out, uncomfortable and revealing. When he finally responded, "No, I would not have." The impact on the jury was palpable. Even Bailey's staunchest defender had been forced to acknowledge the gap between the son he thought he knew and the evidence of corruption now before the court. In that moment, the defense lost more ground than they'd gained through the entire emotional testimony. The defense case took another significant blow when their star witness, security expert Raymond Valdez, failed to appear for scheduled testimony about potential alternative suspects from the Alvarez organization. Court officers reported that Valdez had checked out of his hotel the previous evening without explanation, his phone going straight to voicemail. This unexpected development forced Gould to request a continuance, which Judge Blackwell reluctantly granted for one day only. The following morning brought the revelation that Valdez, upon reviewing the full evidence in preparation for his testimony, had concluded he could not in good conscience support the defense theory. He'd returned to his home in Texas rather than potentially perjure himself. When a defense expert refuses to testify after seeing all the evidence, that tells you everything you need to know about the strength of the case, or lack thereof. With their case rapidly unraveling, the defense made the high-risk decision to put Marcus Bailey himself on the stand. It's a move legal experts generally advise against when evidence is substantial, but which can sometimes sway juries through direct emotional appeal. Bailey took the oath with the practiced solemnity of a man who had administered it to countless others. His demeanor carefully calibrated to project sincerity and regret rather than his earlier arrogance. Under Gould's gentle questioning, Bailey presented the modified narrative they had pivoted to. He admitted returning home to retrieve documents for his Boston meeting, discovered Vanessa dead in what appeared to be a drug-related killing, panicked about being blamed due to their marital problems. "I made a terrible, unforgivable mistake in not reporting what I found," Bailey testified, his voice catching in what appeared to be genuine emotion. "I was thinking about my position, my reputation, and I convinced myself she must have gotten involved with dangerous people through her investigations into my finances. It was a performance. Everyone could see that. But was it convincing enough? Could Bailey's natural charisma and authority overcome the mountain of evidence against him?" The answer came during Evans's methodical cross-examination. The prosecutor began by establishing a clear timeline, having Bailey confirm his presence at home during the exact window when Vanessa was killed. Then she systematically dismantled his claim of finding her already dead. "Chief Bailey, if you merely discovered your wife's body as you now claim, how do you explain your DNA under her fingernails?" Evans asked, her tone conversational but relentless. Bailey's explanation, that the DNA resulted from normal marital contact that morning, contradicted the medical examiner's testimony about fresh skin cells beneath broken nails, indicating a struggle at the time of death. Each answer Bailey gave created new problems. Each explanation opened new questions. When Evans played portions of Vanessa's audio recording again, focusing on Bailey's threat that people who push too hard into things that don't concern them tend to have accidents, she asked whether these sounded like the words of a man who would later be shocked to find his wife murdered. Bailey's composed facade began to crack. You could see the frustration building, the anger simmering beneath the surface of his careful testimony. The cross-examination reached its climax when Evans presented the evidence log showing Bailey had signed out the zip ties found on Vanessa's wrists the day before her murder. "Chief Bailey, why would drug dealers who supposedly killed your wife use police-issue restraints that you personally signed out from the evidence room?" Evans asked, allowing the question to hang in the courtroom like smoke. Bailey's eventual answer, suggesting someone must have stolen the zip ties from his vehicle to frame him, contradicted his earlier testimony and appeared patently implausible to many jurors. Several exchanged glances or made notes. The lies were piling up, contradictions multiplying, and everyone could see it happening in real time. Throughout this exchange, Bailey's demeanor progressively deteriorated, his initial calm replaced by defensive aggression that emerged despite obvious coaching to remain measured. When Evans pressed him on the gunshot residue found on his jacket cuff, Bailey's composure finally broke. "You've been out to get me from the beginning. This whole case is a vendetta against me for cleaning up the department." This outburst provided Evans the opening to explore Bailey's temperament and sense of entitlement, characteristics central to the prosecution's theory about his motive and actions. "Chief Bailey, Do you believe the laws you enforced apply equally to you? She asked, her tone even as she drove toward the heart of the case. Bailey's hesitation before answering was damning. He needed to calculate the best response rather than simply affirming a principle fundamental to justice. His eventual "of course they do" rang hollow after the pause. Evans reinforced this impression by presenting evidence of multiple instances where Bailey had used his position to avoid consequences. Fixing parking tickets, pressuring officers to overlook his traffic violations, using department resources for personal errands. These examples, while minor compared to murder, established a pattern of behavior consistent with someone who indeed believed rules applied differently to him than to others. The defense suffered its final devastating blow when Gould called a surprise witness, Diego Alvarez, nephew of the drug organization's leader, who had agreed to testify that members of their group had killed Vanessa after discovering her investigation. This high-risk strategy backfired spectacularly during Evans's cross-examination when she produced prison phone records showing multiple calls between Bailey and Alvarez's uncle in the weeks leading up to the trial. The testimony had been arranged, bought and paid for, most likely. When confronted with these records, Alvarez became visibly uncomfortable. His rehearsed testimony disintegrating under Evans's methodical questioning about specific details of the supposed murder by his associates. The final nail in this defense strategy came when Evans presented evidence that Alvarez had been in county jail on an unrelated charge on the day of Vanessa's murder, making it impossible for him to have first-hand knowledge of the events he claimed to be describing. He'd been locked up, behind bars, when Vanessa was killed. So much for that theory. Following this disastrous witness testimony, Richard Gould made the tactical decision to rest the defense case rather than risk further damage from additional witnesses. His closing argument focused on creating reasonable doubt through potential procedural issues rather than directly challenging the substantial evidence. Gould emphasized the pressure on investigators to solve the high-profile case quickly, suggested corners may have been cut in the rush to build a case against Bailey, reminded jurors of Bailey's 20 years of service. He argued the audio recording lacked context for the threatening statements, suggested alternative interpretations for the financial evidence. While delivered with Gould's characteristic eloquence, the closing argument had a hollow quality that reflected the overwhelming evidence the defense had failed to effectively counter. When your best argument is, maybe they made mistakes, and he served for 20 years, you're basically admitting you've got nothing. ADA Sophia Evans approached her closing argument with the same methodical precision that had characterized the prosecution's entire case. She began by reminding jurors of Vanessa King, not just as a murder victim, but as a woman of integrity who had discovered her husband's corruption and chosen to expose it despite the risks. Evans then walked through the comprehensive timeline they had established, Bailey signing out the zip ties the day before the murder, creating an alibi through his Boston meeting, returning home during the precise window when Vanessa was killed, staging a break-in, attempting to establish further alibi coverage through his call to Leah Greer. The prosecutor methodically connected this timeline to the physical evidence, the DNA under Vanessa's fingernails, the gunshot residue on Bailey's jacket, the ballistic match to his service weapon, creating a narrative that left no room for reasonable alternative explanations. Marcus Bailey murdered his wife because she threatened his carefully constructed house of lies, Evans concluded, her voice clear and unwavering as she addressed the jury directly. He killed her to silence her before she could expose his corruption, his embezzlement, his multiple secret families, and his protection of drug traffickers. He killed her because he believed his badge made him untouchable, that the laws he enforced didn't apply to him. Today, you have the opportunity to show him, and everyone watching, that no one, regardless of position or power, stands above the law. The jury received the case at 3:42 p.m. on Thursday, November 14, 2024. Court observers had varying predictions about deliberation length given the case's complexity, but also the strength of evidence. The answer came with unexpected swiftness. At 8:17 p.m., after just over 4 hours of deliberation, the jury notified the court they had reached a verdict. As word spread, the courtroom quickly filled. Spectators, journalists, family members from both sides. The tension was palpable as they awaited the jury's decision. Marcus Bailey was brought in from the holding cell, his expression revealing nothing as he took his place beside his attorney. though observers noted his hands trembled slightly as he straightened his jacket. A rare display of nerves from the formerly confident police chief. Will the defendant please rise? Judge Blackwell instructed as the jury filed in. Bailey stood alongside Gould, his posture rigid as if at attention. Years of police training asserting themselves in this moment of extreme stress. The court clerk took the verdict form from the jury foreperson and handed it to Judge Blackwell. After reviewing the document briefly, the judge returned it to the clerk for reading. In the case of the state of Rhode Island versus Marcus Bailey, on the count of murder in the first degree, we the jury find the defendant guilty. The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Guilty. The clerk continued reading guilty verdicts for the additional charges: embezzlement, accepting bribes, obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence. But these seemed almost anticlimactic after the murder conviction that would likely keep Bailey imprisoned for the remainder of his life. Bailey showed little visible reaction as the verdicts were read, though those seated nearest reported a perceptible slump in his shoulders, as if the weight he'd been fighting against had finally become too much to bear. In the gallery, reactions varied dramatically. Muted celebrations from Vanessa's family, their relief and vindication palpable. Tears from Bailey's mother, Patricia, her face buried in her hands. A complex expression of both vindication and sorrow from Kyle Thorne, who had lost a brother to prison in the process of seeking justice for Vanessa. Judge Blackwell thanked the jury for their service and scheduled sentencing for the following week. As court officers approached to escort the now convicted murderer from the courtroom, Bailey turned briefly toward his brother in the gallery. Their eyes met in a moment of unspoken communication before he was led away to begin facing the consequences of actions he had long believed he would escape. The Providence Journal's headline the next morning captured the city's collective processing. Fallen Chief Bailey convicted on all counts. The accompanying analysis noted how the case had exposed deep corruption within multiple institutions and prompted reviews of cases Bailey had overseen during his tenure, potentially affecting dozens of prosecutions tainted by his involvement. Police reform advocates pointed to the conviction as evidence of the need for stronger oversight and accountability measures. Law enforcement representatives emphasized that Bailey's crimes had been exposed through the integrity of officers like Detective Mitchell and Kyle Thorne, demonstrating that the system could police itself when individual officers honored their oaths. The debate would continue, but for now, at least, justice had spoken, clearly and unequivocally. 1 week later, the sentencing hearing would bring the final chapter of Marcus Bailey's downfall, and with it, a moment that would define the entire case.